The air inside the high-tech garage was thick with expensive failure. In the center sat a multi-million-dollar hypercar, its engine bay wide open, a chaotic masterpiece of titanium. 100 of the finest mechanics had poked, prodded, and failed to start it. The CEO stood with arms crossed, her patience gone. "Scrap the launch," she commanded coldly. In the shadows, a single dad in grease-stained overalls was changing a light bulb. Their eyes met. She smirked. "You think you can fix what experts couldn't?" He stepped forward, wiping his hands. "Give me 60 seconds." The room laughed. Seconds later, the laughter died. Daniel Cruz was 42 years old, but his hands looked 10 years older. They were the hands of a man who spent his life wrestling with the physical world, scarred by heat and etched with the permanent grime of 1,000 engine blocks. He was a short-term contract mechanic, the kind of person companies hired to do the work no one else wanted to do. He was the man who fixed the leaky faucets, replaced the flickering ballasts, and ensured the floors were clean enough for the real engineers to walk on. But Daniel didn't mind the invisibility. In fact, he leaned into it. Since the day his wife, Elena, had passed away from a sudden heart complication, Daniel's world had shrunk to a very specific, very precious radius. His 9-year-old son, Leo. Every decision Daniel made was filtered through the lens of Leo's well-being. He had once been a rising star in military aviation, a lead engineer who designed the dampening systems for the next generation of stealth rotors. He had been a man of titles and accolades, but titles required 60-hour work weeks. Accolades required travel, and Leo required a father who was there to make breakfast, to help with math homework, and to tuck him in at night. The silence of his apartment in the mornings was a constant reminder of what he had lost, but it was also a sanctuary he defended fiercely. He had spent years in the high-stress environment of defense contracting, where a single decimal point error could mean the loss of a multi-million-dollar aircraft, or worse, the lives of a crew. That level of responsibility left a mark on a man. It made him precise, it made him observant, and it made him quiet. When Elena died, that precision turned inward. He began to apply the same rigorous safety protocols he used for helicopter turbines to his own life with Leo. Everything was scheduled. Everything was double-checked. The walls of their modest home were lined with Leo's drawings and Daniel's old engineering textbooks, relics of a life he had traded for something more meaningful. He spent his evenings not at gala dinners, but sitting on a rug, explaining the physics of a Lego tower to a captivated boy. He knew that the world saw him as a janitor with a wrench, but in Leo's eyes, he was an architect of universes. This duality defined him. He was a master of machines who chose to be a servant of love. He returned to the civilian market with a resume that showed a massive gap in employment, a gap that most recruiters viewed as a red flag. They didn't see a devoted father. They saw a man whose skills had presumably gone stagnant. He was relegated to auxiliary maintenance. He was the guy who changed the bulbs. But while Daniel changed those bulbs, he never stopped being an engineer. His mind was a perpetual motion machine of diagnostic thought. He didn't just see a garage, he saw a symphony of mechanical vibrations. He could hear the specific pitch of a cooling fan that was beginning to wobble 3 bays away. He could feel the micro-tremors in the floor that signaled a pressurized line was losing its integrity before the sensors even tripped. He didn't participate in the high-level meetings where men in expensive suits argued over flow charts. He didn't offer his opinion when the ivory tower engineers debated the thermal dynamics of the new V-12. He stayed in his lane. He stayed silent. But he knew. He knew that the engine in the center of the room wasn't dead. It wasn't a failure of material science or a flaw in the software architecture. It was simply a machine that was being misunderstood by people who looked at screens instead of listening to the metal. Every morning, before dropping Leo at school, Daniel would quiz him on the sounds of the neighborhood. It was their private game, a way to pass the time in traffic. "What's that, Leo?" he'd ask as a bus hissed past. "Air brakes, Dad. Pressure release," Leo would chirp, his eyes bright with pride. Daniel was teaching his son to listen to the world, to understand that everything has a voice if you know how to hear it. At work, Daniel applied the same philosophy. While the 100 experts plugged in their diagnostic laptops and ran simulations, Daniel watched the way the engine block settled on its mounts. He watched the way the fluid pulsed through the clear test lines, looking for the tiny bubbles that shouldn't be there. He noticed the tiny, almost imperceptible hesitation in the valve timing that occurred only when the ambient temperature in the garage hit a certain threshold. He saw the ghost in the machine that a computer would dismiss as noise. He was a man no one counted on, yet he held a lifetime of specialized military knowledge behind his quiet, tired eyes. The project was the Apex One, a revolutionary engine designed to be the crown jewel of the company's global launch. It was a marvel of engineering, or it was supposed to be. But for 3 weeks, it had been a nightmare. The system would throw random, catastrophic error codes the moment the RPMs climbed toward the red line. It was a phantom glitch, a digital shadow that vanished as soon as you tried to measure it. The engineers had replaced the ECU 5 times, thinking it was a faulty processor. They had rewired the entire harness. They had even swapped out the fuel injectors and the turbochargers. Nothing worked. Every time they thought they had solved it, the engine would stutter, cough, and go into limp mode just as it reached peak performance. The tension in the garage was palpable, a thick fog of anxiety that affected everyone from the janitors to the senior VPs. The failure was becoming a public relations disaster. Shareholders were breathing down the neck of Victoria Hale, the 37-year-old CEO who had staked her entire reputation on the Apex One. Victoria was a woman of data. She believed in metrics, in rigorous testing, and in the absolute authority of her expert panel. She had spent her career climbing the ladder by being the most prepared person in the room. But as the Friday deadline approached, her confidence was crumbling. The garage was filled with the brightest minds from Germany, Japan, and Italy. They stood in clusters, their faces lit by the blue glow of their tablets, speaking in hushed, urgent tones. They ran simulations that showed the engine should be working perfectly. They checked the metallurgy of the pistons. They analyzed the fuel chemistry. But the machine refused to cooperate. It was as if the engine had a mind of its own, a stubborn streak that defied all logic. The cost of failure was staggering. Beyond the billions in research and development, thousands of jobs were on the line. Victoria felt the weight of every employee's mortgage on her shoulders. She paced the perimeter of the bay, her heels clicking rhythmically on the polished concrete, a sound that matched the ticking clock in her head. She had hired the best, paid the most, and yet she was staring at a pile of useless metal. If they couldn't find the fix by the end of the week, the project would be shuttered, billions would be lost, and the company's stock would plummet. She had gathered 100 of the most decorated mechanics and engineers from across the globe, offering them a blank check to solve the mystery. They had poked, prodded, and measured every square inch of the machine. And they had found nothing. The air smelled of burnt oil and desperation. When Daniel Cruz walked from the shadows into the harsh light of the testing bay and suggested he could fix it in 60 seconds, the room didn't just laugh, it felt insulted. The head of the engineering team, a man with 3 PhDs and a penchant for expensive watches, mocked him openly. "You want 60 seconds? We've had 60,000 minutes and the best hardware on the planet. Go back to your light bulbs, Cruz. This isn't a toaster." But Victoria Hale looked at Daniel. She saw the grease under his fingernails, but she also saw the calm, unshakable focus in his eyes. It was a look she hadn't seen on any of her experts. Her experts looked panicked. They looked like gamblers who had lost their last cent. This man looked like he was about to solve a crossword puzzle. He didn't have a tablet. He didn't have a sensor array. He just had a rag and a pair of steady hands. "Fine," Victoria said, silencing the room with a sharp wave of her hand. The silence that followed was heavy, punctuated only by the distant hum of the ventilation system. "Entertain us, Mr. Cruz. You have 60 seconds. If you fail, you're fired for wasting my time and insulting this team. If you succeed, well, let's just see you try." Daniel didn't hesitate. He didn't walk to the computer terminals to check the latest telemetry. He didn't ask for a printout of the error logs. He walked straight to the engine, moving with a deliberate, slow grace that seemed at odds with the frantic energy of the room. He didn't see a multi-million-dollar prototype. He saw a collection of parts that were out of harmony. He placed his bare palms on the cold intake manifold. He didn't speak. He didn't move. He closed his eyes, his head tilted slightly to the side. He was waiting for the machine to tell him where it was hurting. To the onlookers, he looked like he was performing some kind of strange, mechanical seance. To Daniel, he was simply tuning in to the frequency of the metal, searching for the one note that didn't belong. The first twist came with a request that no one expected. "Shut it down," Daniel said, his eyes still closed. "Everything. I mean everything. Turn off the overhead fans. Stop the diagnostic servers. Power down the lights if you have to. I want total silence in this garage." Victoria nodded to her security team, and slowly the hum of the facility died away. The blue glow of the monitors vanished. The only sound left was the distant sound of traffic outside and the heavy, rhythmic breathing of 100 frustrated men standing in the dark. "Start it," Daniel commanded. The lead engineer, his hands shaking slightly, turned the key. The Apex One roared to life, a savage, beautiful sound that echoed off the concrete walls like a caged beast. Daniel leaned in close, his ear inches from the spinning belts and the searing heat of the manifold. He signaled for the engineer to increase the revs. As the needle climbed, the engine roared, a mechanical scream that filled the room. At exactly 0, 7 seconds after the throttle opened, a sound occurred. It wasn't a clank or a bang. It was a tiny, high-pitched harmonic resonance, a singing of a wire that shouldn't have been there. It was a frequency so specific and so brief that the digital sensors, programmed to look for massive fluctuations in pressure or temperature, ignored it as background interference. But to a man who had spent years in a hangar listening for the minute flutter of a damaged rotor blade that could cause a helicopter to fall from the sky, it was as loud as a siren. Daniel reached into the heart of the machine, his hand moving with surgical precision through the heat. Without a wrench, without a laptop, he found a specific sensor lead. It had been mounted a fraction of a millimeter too close to the vibration-dampening bracket. It wasn't broken. It wasn't faulty. But at a specific RPM, the bracket would vibrate at a frequency that created a microstatic charge. That charge sent a ghost signal to the ECU, telling the computer the engine was experiencing a catastrophic knock when it was actually perfectly healthy. The computer, being a loyal soldier, would then shut down the systems to prevent an explosion that was never going to happen. He felt the heat radiating from the block, a fierce warmth that would have made a lesser man flinch. But Daniel's skin was tough, tempered by decades of such encounters. He felt the specific rhythm of the static, a jagged, irregular pulse that clashed with the engine's natural beat. It was a hidden language, a secret conversation between metal and electricity that only he was privy to. With a flick of his wrist, he redirected the narrative. Daniel simply moved the wire 3 millimeters to the left and tightened a plastic clip. He didn't buy a new part. He didn't rewrite a line of code. He simply gave the machine the space it needed to breathe. He stepped back and wiped his hands. "Try it again," Daniel said. The engineer floored the pedal. The needle buried itself in the red line and stayed there. The engine didn't stutter. It didn't cough. It sang a pure, terrifyingly powerful note that lasted for a full 30 seconds without a single error code appearing on the screens. The Ice Queen, Victoria Hale, stood frozen. Her jaw didn't drop. She was too composed for that. But her eyes widened in a way that signaled a complete internal shift. The 100 experts were staring at their screens in disbelief, the green lines of the diagnostic data finally, perfectly flat. The fix had taken exactly 58 seconds. The second twist arrived when the silence returned to the garage. Victoria walked up to Daniel, her gaze intense, searching his face for an answer to a question she hadn't yet formulated. "Why didn't you tell anyone before?" she asked, her voice no longer cold, but genuinely curious. "You've been in this building for 6 months. You've watched us struggle for 3 weeks. Why wait until we were seconds away from scrapping the whole project?" Daniel looked at her, then looked at the crowd of men who had spent the last hour laughing at him. "No one asked," he said simply. The weight of that statement hung in the air like lead. It was a stinging indictment of the entire corporate culture. He explained that he had once been the man who designed these systems for the military. He had been the expert in the room. But when he chose to be a father, he lost his title. And in this industry, if you don't have the title, you don't have a voice. He hadn't stayed silent out of spite. He had stayed silent because he knew that in a room full of egos and PhDs, a man with a light bulb in his hand is invisible. He didn't need to prove he was the smartest person in the room. He had already proven that to himself years ago in the belly of a Chinook helicopter over the desert. He only stepped forward because he couldn't stand to see a good machine go to waste. He didn't need the glory. He just wanted to get the job done so he could go home. The garage fell into a profound, uncomfortable silence. 100 mechanics realized they had spent 3 weeks looking at everything except the truth, because they were too busy looking at themselves. Victoria Hale was not a woman who let an opportunity slip through her fingers. She recognized talent, and more importantly, she recognized character. Before Daniel could even walk back to his corner to finish changing his light bulb, she was standing in his path. "I want you to head the technical division," she stated. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a decree. "I'll triple your current salary. No, quadruple it. You'll have your own office, your own team, and a budget that would make the military jealous. We need your ears, Daniel. We need your silence." The room held its breath. This was the dream. This was the Cinderella story of the corporate world. From a maintenance man to the head of a global engineering department in the span of 60 seconds. The experts looked on with a mix of envy and grudging respect. They expected him to jump at the chance, to drop his rag and shake her hand. They expected him to ask about the bonus structure or the stock options. But Daniel Cruz didn't look excited. He didn't look like a man who had just won the lottery. He looked at his watch. It was 3:45 p.m. Can I leave by 4 o'clock? He asked. Victoria blinked, completely thrown off guard. The executives behind her whispered in confusion. What? We're talking about a multi-million-dollar career move, Daniel. We're talking about the future of this company. There are contracts to sign, press releases to draft, a global launch to coordinate. My son gets out of school at 4:15, Daniel interrupted gently, but with a firmness that brook no argument. He's 9 years old. He's had a long day, and he's expecting me to be at the gate. If this job means I'm still sitting in a boardroom at 6 p.m. while he's waiting on a curb, then the answer is no. I've had the big office before, Ms. Hale. I've had the awards and the 6-figure bonuses. It's a lonely place to be when you're the only one there to celebrate. The quiet authority in his voice was more intimidating than any corporate threat. He spoke with the conviction of a man who had already faced his greatest fears and come out on the other side with a clear sense of purpose. He wasn't rejecting the money or the status. He was simply refusing to let them dictate the terms of his soul. He had seen too many men lose themselves in the pursuit of more, only to find they had nothing when it truly mattered. Victoria looked around the garage. She saw her 100 engineers, men who lived in their offices, men who had sacrificed their marriages and their relationships with their children for their careers. She saw the exhaustion in their eyes and the hollowness of their victory. And then she looked at Daniel. She saw a man who knew exactly what he was worth, and more importantly, he knew what his time was worth. He wasn't playing a negotiation tactic. He was stating a boundary. For the first time in her career, Victoria felt a flicker of something she hadn't experienced in years. Genuine respect for another person's priorities. The school is 12 minutes from here, Victoria said, her voice softening, her professional mask slipping for just a moment. If you take the job, I'll provide a company car that gets you there in 8. And you can leave at 4 p.m. every single day. No meetings after 3:30. No exceptions. We don't just need your skills, Daniel. We need your perspective. We need a man who knows when to stop working. Daniel looked at her for a long moment, searching for any sign of corporate insincerity. He saw that she meant it. He saw that she realized the Apex one didn't just need a better sensor. The whole company needed a better heart. He finally nodded and reached out to shake her hand. I'll keep the overalls, he said with a small smile. I don't think I'd feel right in a suit. Grease is easier to wash off than the feeling of being someone I'm not. He accepted the position because it would allow him to provide a better life for Leo, without sacrificing the time that made that life worth living. That evening, the house was filled with the smell of home-cooked tacos and the sound of a 9-year-old's laughter. Daniel sat at the small kitchen table, listening to Leo describe his day in painstaking detail. A story about a lost pencil, a difficult long division problem, and a game of tag that went on for 20 minutes during recess. Daniel listened with the same intensity he had used on the engine. He didn't check his phone. He didn't think about the global launch. He was exactly where he needed to be. The kitchen light flickered slightly, a minor imperfection he would fix later, but for now, the golden glow on Leo's face was enough. He watched his son's hands move as he talked, seeing the same innate curiosity that had once driven his own younger self. He realized that by choosing this path, he wasn't just saving his own time. He was teaching Leo how to value his own life. Did you win something today, Dad? Leo asked, noticing the slight change in his father's demeanor, a lightness that hadn't been there that morning. Daniel laughed and ruffled his son's hair. No, Leo. I just listened. It turns out that's a pretty valuable skill. More valuable than any wrench or any computer. Leo hugged him tight before heading to bed. I know, Dad. You always hear me when I'm calling you from the backyard, even when the lawnmower is on. You're like a superhero with super hearing. As Daniel sat in the quiet of his living room, he realized that the Apex One wasn't the only thing that had been fixed that day. For years, he had carried the weight of his gap year like a badge of shame, feeling like a man who had failed his potential because he chose his family. He had felt like he was hiding in the shadows. But in 60 seconds, he had realized that his potential was never gone. It had just been waiting for the right moment to be used on his own terms. He wasn't a failed engineer. He was an engineer who had found a better design for his life. Back at the garage, long after the crowds had gone home and the janitors had swept the floors, Victoria Hale stood alone in the testing bay. The facility was dark, save for the single light over the Apex One. She stood by the car and started the engine one more time. The sound was perfect, a steady, rhythmic heartbeat of power. But she wasn't looking at the car. She was looking at the corner where Daniel had been changing the light bulb. She realized that she had been surrounded by 100 experts who knew how to talk. But she had been saved by one man who knew how to be still. She thought about her own life, the missed birthdays, the cold dinners, the hollow victories of the corporate ladder. She realized that Daniel hadn't just fixed a motor. He had exposed a flaw in the way they all lived. He had proven that being the best at what you do doesn't require sacrificing the people you love. Sometimes the most important work isn't done under the spotlight. It's done in the shadows, with patience, integrity, and a heart that knows where it belongs. The world would remember the Apex One as a triumph of engineering. The history books would talk about the revolution in engine design. But in a small house on the edge of town, a single dad was just a hero to a 9-year-old boy. And to Daniel, that was the only 60 seconds of fame he would ever truly need. The project was launched, the company's stock soared, and the industry was changed forever. But every day at 4 p.m., a grease-stained engineer would lay down his tools, wash his hands, and drive toward a school gate, because he knew that some things are too important to be kept waiting. At High TL Stories, we believe that true value doesn't need to shout to be recognized. In a world obsessed with noise, we celebrate the power of the quiet expert and the strength of the devoted heart. If this story reminded you that your worth is not defined by your title, but by the integrity of your actions, please subscribe and join our community. Let's celebrate the everyday heroes who do the extraordinary, simply by being exactly who they are. Thank you for listening, and remember, sometimes the most important thing you can do is just listen.